The morning Zora Stonefist walked into Harrow's mill, she did it the way she did everything, with her chin up and her expectations low. The town of Harrow's mill sat at the edge of what most frontier maps simply labeled the Western Reach, a sprawling stretch of open grassland and pine-heavy ridgelines where the settlements thinned out and the winters came in hard and mean. It was the kind of place that attracted people who wanted to be left alone, who had run out of roads somewhere further east and simply stopped walking. The mill itself was the oldest building in town, a great creaking structure that straddled the Harrow Creek and turned all day long, its wheel groaning with a sound like an old man climbing stairs. Around it had grown a modest collection of buildings: a general store, a smithy, a tavern called the Stump and Stone, a post station, and a scattering of homes and outbuildings that petered out into farmland and then into nothing. Zora had come from the Stonefist clan's encampment, a 3-hour walk through the pine country north of town. The clan had settled the high ridge 2 seasons past, drawn by the elk herds and the fresh water, and they had been careful, deliberate, quiet neighbors. They traded fur and bone tools at the market when they could, kept to themselves otherwise, and generally did their best to give the people of Harrow's mill as little reason for grievance as possible. It had not been entirely successful. There was always a reason for grievance when orcs were involved, or so certain people believed. Zora was 24 years old, tall and broad-shouldered in the way that orc women were, with the kind of physical presence that made doorways feel smaller simply by approaching them. Her skin was the deep olive green of river moss in summer, her eyes a warm amber that caught light like lantern glass. Her hair was black and thick, braided back from her face in a tight practical rope that fell between her shoulder blades. She had her mother's high cheekbones and her father's jaw, and a pair of tusks that curved just slightly at the tips, small ones by clan standards, delicate even, though she had never thought of them that way. She wore a heavy wool tunic the color of cedar bark, leather trousers, and boots that had been resoled twice. Over one shoulder she carried a canvas pack, and at her hip she wore a knife the way everyone on the frontier wore a knife, not as a weapon exactly, just as a thing a person needed. She had come for grain, specifically for rye flour and cracked barley, because the clan stores were running lower than they should have been for this deep into the cold season, and the elk had moved south of the ridge earlier than expected. There was a child with a chest cough in camp, and 2 of the elder women were asking for hot porridge they could not make without grain. It was a practical errand, a simple one. Nothing about walking into Harrow's mill felt simple. She felt the stairs begin at the edge of town, where 2 men were repairing a fence post along the road. They stopped working and watched her pass without saying anything, which was somehow worse than if they had said something. She kept her eyes forward. At the hitching post outside the Stump and Stone, a man in a canvas coat spat into the mud as she walked by, not quite at her feet but close enough to make his meaning clear. She did not slow her pace. The general store was called Peddle's, after the family that had run it for 20 years, though Emmett Peddle had died the previous spring, and his widow had taken over without changing the sign. It was a narrow, dark building packed floor to ceiling with goods, sacks of flour and grain along one wall, tools and rope along another, preserves and dried goods in between. It smelled of sawdust and old wool, and something faintly sweet that might have been molasses. Zora pushed open the door and stepped inside, ducking slightly as she always did in human-built doorways, though this one was just barely tall enough. The bell above the door chimed. There were 2 people already inside, a woman examining a bolt of cloth near the window, and a man leaning against the far counter with his arms crossed, talking to whoever was behind it. The woman with the cloth glanced up and then looked sharply away, gathering her bolt and moving further down the aisle. The man at the counter straightened and half-turned, and Zora cataloged him in the way she had learned to catalog people in towns, quickly, assessing, watching for the shift in posture that meant trouble. He was maybe 27 or 28, Not especially tall for a human man, but solidly built. The kind of build that came from actual work rather than any particular effort toward it. He wore a wool shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and canvas trousers tucked into plain boots. His hair was a dark reddish-brown, a little too long, curling at the ears in a way that suggested he'd been meaning to cut it for a while. His face was weathered and honest-looking, with a jaw that was just starting to show the early shadow of a beard that hadn't committed to itself yet. He had dark green eyes, she noticed, not a common color, and they were looking at her with an expression she did not immediately recognize, because it was neither hostility nor the particular blank politeness that people used as a substitute for hostility. He just looked curious. He looked at her the way a person looks at the sky when they're trying to figure out if it's going to rain. "Morning," he said. She blinked. "Morning," she replied and moved toward the counter. The woman behind the counter was small and white-haired, probably widow Petal herself, and she was watching Zora with the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned that showing too much of her feelings was bad for business. "Help you?" she asked. "Rye flour," Zora said. 20 pounds if you have it, and cracked barley 10 pounds. "That's a heavy carry," the woman said. "I know." There was a brief pause in which something was being calculated. Zora had been in enough general stores to know what the calculation was, whether to serve her, whether to overcharge her, whether to find a reason to tell her the goods weren't available even when they clearly were. She waited. "I'll have to weigh it out," Widow Petal said finally, and moved down the counter toward the sacks along the wall. Zora stood at the counter and waited. The man who had said morning was still nearby, not hovering exactly but not leaving either. He had turned back to look at something on the shelf beside the counter, a row of small tin containers, some kind of seed stock by the look of them. But he was relaxed in his presence in a way that made her think he hadn't decided he needed to be anywhere else. "You're from the camp on the ridge," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. She looked at him. "Yes." "Harvey Warren," he said, and offered his hand across the counter space in her direction. The casualness of it was startling enough that she almost didn't respond. She reached out and shook it. His grip was firm and he shook once properly, the way you shook hands with someone you expected to shake hands with again. "Zora Stonefist," she said. "You farming folks or hunting folks up there on the ridge?" She studied him for a moment. "Both. Mostly hunting. Some of us tend a small garden in the growing months." He nodded like this was an entirely reasonable answer to an entirely reasonable question. "Hard season for hunting. Elk moved early. I've got a place out along the creek road about a mile east, south-facing slope, so I've got a decent grain store. Not much market for rye flour when most of the farms are producing it, but I've got more barley than I can use this winter." He said it like he was talking about the weather, just noting a fact. Zora looked at him steadily. "I'm buying, not asking for charity." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "I know. I'm saying if the widow's supply runs short, which it might given that Olson's farm just put in a big order last week, you can come out to my place and I'll sell you what I've got. Same prices here. Probably better quality, honestly. I dried it myself this fall." Widow Petal returned at that moment with a heavy canvas bag and a scale, and the weighing out began. "The flour came to 18 pounds. She was short on rye," she said, "but could offer the rest in wheat. The barley came out to the full 10. The price was fair, just barely." Zora counted out her coins from a small leather pouch and pushed them across the counter. She hauled both bags up and settled them against her body, the weight distributed across her shoulders. 30 pounds of grain was manageable. She had carried heavier. The bell above the door chimed again, and cold air came in with a man she didn't know, heavyset and red-faced, who stopped when he saw her and said something short and ugly under his breath that she pretended not to hear. Harvey Warren looked at the man and said, very pleasantly, "Morning, Decker. You need something." The man called Decker looked between Zora and Harvey with an expression like he had bitten into something he expected to be sweet and found it wasn't. "Just picking up my order," he said, and moved past her to the counter with the performance of a man pretending he hadn't said anything. Zora walked to the door and pulled it open with one hand while managing the bags with the other, which was awkward enough that she had to pause. She felt the cold air on her face and felt also the weight of the bags and the weight of everything else, the stares on the road, the spitting man, the calculations in the widow's eyes, and something in her chest was tight with it. "Here," said Harvey Warren from behind her. She turned. He had crossed the store in the time it had taken her to reach the door, and he was holding the door open now, but that wasn't what she was looking at. He was taking his coat off, a heavy brown wool coat with a fleece collar, well-made, clearly used, and he was holding it out to her. She stared at it. "It's going to come in cold off the ridge by noon," he said. "You've got a 3-hour walk and your hands are going to be full." He nodded at the bags. "I'm just going back to my farm, take the coat." "I have a coat," she said. "Where is it?" She realized she had left it at camp. She had not expected to be cold this morning. The walk down had been mild, but the sky to the north had the flat white look that meant weather coming, and he was right that it would be cold by noon. She had not brought a coat because she had been in a hurry, and because she had told herself she didn't need one, which was the kind of thinking that got people into trouble on the frontier. "I'll bring it back," she said. It came out more like a question than she intended. "Whenever you're in town next," he said simply, and something about the way he said it, no urgency, no conditions, no performance of generosity, made it harder to argue with than any amount of pressure would have. She took the coat. It was warm from him, heavier than it looked, and it smelled like wood smoke and pine pitch and something else, something clean and faintly earthy that she couldn't name. She pulled it on over her tunic, and it was too wide in the shoulders and too long in the sleeves, built for a man's frame and not hers, but it was warm, deeply warm. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that felt more complicated than the words. "Safe walk," he said. She went out into the cold morning with 30 pounds of grain and a borrowed coat, and something she couldn't name sitting heavy in her chest, heavier in some ways than the flour and barley combined, and she walked the 3 miles back up to the ridge without stopping. She thought about his eyes, which was ridiculous, and she told herself to stop it, and she kept walking. The clan made porridge that night. The elder women ate it with their eyes closed in the way of people who have been genuinely hungry, which is the most honest form of gratitude. The child with the chest cough ate 3 bowls and fell asleep with color in his cheeks. Zora sat with her back against the log wall of the great house and watched the fire and wore the coat still, because the great house had gaps in the chinking that let the cold in, and because she had not found a reason to take it off yet. Her cousin Mara, who was 19 and possessed of the particular sharpness that came with being 19 and paying attention, sat down beside her and looked at the coat the way only a 19-year-old cousin can look at something with total, weaponized perception. "That's a human coat," Mara said, very observant. "Where did you get a human coat?" "A man in town," Zora said. "It's borrowed." Mara looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to have to go back to town to return it." "Yes, so you have to go back to town. That's what borrowed means." Mara smiled very slightly in a way that said everything she was choosing not to say out loud, and got up and went to get more porridge. Zora pulled the coat a little tighter and stared into the fire. She returned the coat 3 weeks later. She had meant to go sooner, but the weather had closed in hard the week after her first visit, and traveling down the ridge in 3 feet of new snow was inadvisable even for her. The clan had hunkered down the way they always did, in deep winter fires burning all night, the communal space warm with bodies and breath, the children underfoot, and the elders telling stories. Zora had spent the weeks doing what she always did, hunting when the weather allowed, mending equipment when it didn't, mediating small disputes between clan members who were beginning to wear on each other's patience in the way that close quarters always produced. The coat hung on a peg near her sleeping space the entire time. She had told herself she would put it away, fold it into the storage chest, treat it like any other loaned object, but she kept forgetting to do it. Or kept not doing it, which was a different thing. When the snow eased and the temperature climbed back toward merely cold rather than brutally cold, she folded the coat carefully, wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth to keep it clean for the walk, and headed down to Harrow's mill. She went to Pedals first, thinking to ask after Harvey Warren, where his farm was exactly, since he had said a mile east on the creek road, but she hadn't been to that part of the territory before. But Widow Peddle was busy with a family of settlers who were arguing about the price of nails, and Zora didn't want to wait, so she went out onto the main road instead and asked a woman leading a goat which way the creek road ran. The woman with the goat pointed east without looking at her, which was efficient if not warm. The creek road was a rutted track that ran alongside Harrow Creek for about a mile before the creek bent south into the pine country. Harvey Warren's farm was apparent before she reached it, a clean, well-kept place with a log cabin set back from the road, a barn that was larger than it looked from a distance, a smokehouse, a root cellar built into the hillside, and a kitchen garden plot that was currently covered in snow but whose stakes and frames were visible above the white surface, indicating it was maintained with some care. A split-rail fence marked the property lines. Smoke was coming from the cabin chimney. She knocked on the door and waited. She heard movement inside, a scrape of a chair, footsteps, and then the door opened and Harvey Warren was there in a wool shirt with flour on his hands, which explained the smell coming from the cabin. Bread, she thought, baking bread, which was not something she had expected. He looked at her, then at the oilcloth package in her hands, and something in his expression did a small thing that might have been pleasure before settling back into its usual state, which was warm without making a production of being warm. "Zora Stonefist," he said. "Harvey Warren," she replied. "Your coat." She held out the oilcloth package. He took it, set it on the table inside without unwrapping it. "You want to come in? I've got bread in the oven." She did not immediately say no, which surprised her. "For a minute," she said. The inside of the cabin was one main room and a smaller one through a doorway she could see from the threshold. The main room had a fireplace, a long table, 2 chairs, shelving along one wall packed with jars and tins, and the oven built into the side of the fireplace that was clearly where the bread was happening. It was not fancy, and it was not especially tidy, but it had the organized disorder of a person who knew where everything was without needing it to be arranged. It smelled extraordinary bread and wood smoke and the particular dry warmth of a space that was lived in properly through winter. She sat in one of the chairs. He pulled the bread out, a round, dark loaf in a cast iron pan, and set it on the table with a cloth under it, then put a kettle on. "No family?" she asked, because she was trying to understand the context of this person and his single set of chairs. "Not for a while," he said. "I had a wife. She passed 3 years ago. Fever. It took a lot of people that winter." He said it without particular weight, in the way of someone who has carried a grief long enough that it has found its proper place. "No children. We'd been here only a year when she died, haven't really seen the point of going back east." "I'm sorry," Zora said. "Thank you." He looked at her directly when he said it, not deflecting. "You've got family at the camp, clan family, cousins, elders. My parents passed when I was 17. A hard crossing from the eastern clans." She paused. "We traveled a long way to settle on that ridge." "Why that ridge?" She considered him for a moment. People did not typically ask why. They asked whether orcs were going to cause trouble or whether they were planning to stay, or they didn't ask anything at all. They did not ask why. "It's quiet," she said finally. "There are springs. Good timber without being so dense you can't manage it. The elk come through twice a year, and nobody had claimed it yet." She looked at her hands. "That last part matters." "It does," he said. "That's why I'm here too, more or less." Nobody had claimed this particular stretch of creek. The kettle began to show steam, and he made tea, simple frontier tea, dried herbs and something dark and slightly bitter that was probably one of the root mixes the trading post sold. He cut 2 pieces of bread and put one in front of her without asking. She ate it because it was very good and because she was hungry, and because refusing it seemed like the wrong response to a gesture that had not asked anything of her. They talked for the better part of an hour. She told him about the clan, about the hunting routes, about the child with the chest cough who had recovered. He told her about the farm, about the grain he was growing, about the problems with the east pasture that flooded every spring and what he was trying to do about it. He was easy to talk to in a way she found slightly alarming, because she was not, generally, easy to talk to. She was precise and terse with strangers, and most people seemed relieved by this, as though her being brief absolved them of the awkwardness of talking to her. Harvey Warren did not seem to find talking to her awkward. He engaged with what she said and asked follow-up questions, and listened to her answers with the focused attention of someone for whom listening was a skill they had chosen to practice. When she stood to leave, she noticed a second coat hanging on the peg by the door, a lighter canvas work coat he clearly wore around the farm. "You have 2 coats," she said. "I like to be prepared," he said. She almost smiled. "Well, thank you for the bread." "Come back when you need grain," he said. "I've got more than I need, I mean it." She walked back to the ridge thinking about the bread and the warmth of the cabin and the way he had said her name, Zora Stonefist, like it was just a name, like names were exactly what they were supposed to be and nothing more. She came back in 6 weeks for grain. She told herself it was entirely about the grain, which was partially true. The clan stores were genuinely depleted, and Petals had raised its prices in the way that winter prices always went up when the roads got difficult. Harvey had said his prices were the same as the store. She was being practical. She arrived at the farm mid-morning on a pale, clear day when the snow had crusted over and sparkled in a way that was almost painful to look at. He was in the barn when she arrived and came out carrying 2 wooden pails, one in each hand, and stopped when he saw her. "Good timing," he said. "I was just finishing morning chores. Come around back." The grain store was a separate small building set into the hillside beside the root cellar, cool and dry, with the grain in sealed wooden bins, and a good smell of dried rye and barley, and something slightly sweet that turned out to be dried corn. Weighed out what she needed and she paid, and then he put a small paper-wrapped parcel on top of the bag. "Dried rose hips," he said before she could ask, "for the chest cough. You can steep them in hot water and it helps." She looked at the parcel, then at him. "How do you know about rose hips?" "My wife knew about plants," he said. "She taught me a lot of it before she died. I've got a bunch dried from last fall." He shrugged, not quite casual about it. "Seemed useful." She took the rose hips. "Thank you." "Are you walking back up?" He glanced at the sky. "That south wind is picking up. It'll be cold by the time you hit the ridge elevation." "I'll be fine." "I know you will," he said, without any condescension in it. "I'm just saying I've got a mule I use for hauling. I could drive you up to the tree line and save you a mile of it." She started to refuse and then thought about the heavy bags and the crusted snow and the south wind, and made a practical decision. "All right," she said. The mule was a large, opinionated animal named Chalk who expressed his views about everything through a series of sighs and sideways looks. Harvey hitched him to a small flatbed sledge and loaded her grain onto it, and they walked alongside while Chalk pulled, and the conversation picked up somewhere around where the road curved north toward the ridge. He asked her about Orc clan structure, which no human had ever asked her before. Not with genuine curiosity. She explained it, the Elder Council, the way decisions were made communally, the role of the Stonefist name in their particular clan, which was more of a clan family designation than a surname the way humans used them. He asked questions that indicated he was actually listening to the previous answer before formulating the next one. She asked him about farming, about what the soil was like in this particular valley, about whether the flooding in the east pasture was something he could fix with drainage, or whether it was a matter of the watershed further upstream. He had a specific, grounded knowledge of his land, where it was generous, where it was stubborn, what it wanted from him, that she recognized as the same relationship the clan elders had with the ridge. It was the knowledge that came from paying attention to a place over time instead of trying to bend it to what you wanted it to be. At the tree line where the trail up the ridge began, he stopped the sledge and helped her load the grain bags onto her back in a way that distributed the weight efficiently. "You know your way from here?" he asked. "I've walked it 50 times, she said. "Right." He looked up at the ridge, then back at her. "My name is Harvey Warren, in case you forgot." "I didn't forget," she said. Something moved in his expression, something quiet and warm. "All right, then." She went up the ridge trail and did not look back, which took a very specific kind of effort that she recognized as significant. Spring came late that year, which was typical for the western reach. The snow retreated in stages, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first and clinging to the north-facing ones well into what should have been mild weather. The Harrow Creek ran swollen and fast with meltwater, and the east pasture on Harvey Warren's farm flooded exactly as badly as he had predicted, drowning about a quarter of his early planted seed. Zora heard about this from a trapper named Gus who came through the ridge trail in late spring and traded news for tobacco the way trappers always did. She did not particularly analyze why she found herself thinking about the flooded pasture, about what a flooded pasture meant for a one-man farm heading into a growing season already behind schedule. She went down to Harrow's mill on a Tuesday in early spring when the mud was bad and the road was still half ice and told herself she was going to Peddles for salt and tallow. She went to the farm first. He was in the east pasture when she arrived, standing knee-deep in mud at the edge of the flooding with a long-handled spade in his hands and an expression on his face that was somewhere between resigned and determined. He looked up when he heard the gate, and his expression shifted into something that might have been a surprised version of glad. "You walked down for salt in this," he said, looking at the road she had come from. "I've walked in worse," she said. She looked at the flooded pasture. "What's the drainage situation?" He explained it, the way the meltwater was coming off the north hillside and pooling in the low section because the culvert at the field's edge was blocked with debris from winter. He'd been trying to clear it all morning, but the problem was further up the channel than he'd initially thought. She set down her pack. "Show me." "You don't have to. Show me," she said again. He showed her. The blocked culvert was a timber and stone channel that ran along the field's northern edge and was supposed to carry drainage water off the slope and down into the creek. It was packed solid with 3 feet of compacted dead leaves, branches, and silt. It would have taken Harvey another day of work to clear it alone. They cleared it in 3 hours together. It was not romantic work. It was cold, wet, muddy work that required reaching into freezing water and hauling out armloads of rotting debris, and by the end of it they were both coated to the elbows in black silt and Zora's boots were soaked through. But the water ran when the channel opened. She heard it before she saw it. The change in sound from pooled stillness to moving current, and Harvey let out a long breath and said, "There it is," in a tone of voice she recognized as the particular relief of a problem that had been solved through physical effort, which was its own kind of satisfaction. He made her come inside to dry off, and she did not argue this time. He hung her boots and her soaked wool stockings by the fire, and she sat in her bare feet at his table, and he made a proper meal: bacon and fried potatoes and bread from a fresh batch, the cabin warm and steaming with their wet clothes, and they ate across from each other while the fire popped, and the creek ran fast and purposeful outside. She noticed, looking at him across the table, that he was easier to look at than most people. It was not purely a matter of his face, though she had noted the specifics of his face before now: the green eyes, the jaw, the way the early beard had committed itself since winter into something actual and brown-red and honest. Was more the quality of his attention. He looked at her like she was a person he had decided to look at, without any of the background noise of uncertainty or appraisal that most humans brought to looking at her. She did not say any of this. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask. The people in town, are they giving you trouble when you come down?" She was quiet for a moment. "Some of them." "Who?" "It doesn't matter." He was quiet for a second and then he said, "It matters to me." She looked at him. The fire was making the room amber and warm, and his expression was very level and very serious. "Why?" she asked. "Because you're coming down here to trade, and that's a fair thing to do, and people giving you trouble for it isn't fair." He turned his mug in his hands. "I know what they say about the camp. I hear it in the tavern. I've told people to say it elsewhere." Something in her chest shifted. "You have?" "When Decker says things and I'm there to hear them, yes. He doesn't like it, but he cannot like it." She thought of the morning she had come for grain, the man who had spat near her feet, the careful, neutral calculations of the widow's eyes. She thought of Harvey at the counter saying morning like it was just a word, and shaking her hand like it was just a hand. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. Something in the way he said it made the room feel smaller, not in a bad way, more like closer. More like the walls had moved a little toward the center, which was where they both were. She left before dark, her boots dried and her pack loaded with the salt and tallow she had actually come for, plus a small jar of rendered lard he pressed on her without making a thing of it. The walk back up to the ridge was cool and clear, the sky beginning to show stars at the edges, and she walked it faster than usual, which she told herself was because she wanted to get back before full dark. Her cousin Mara was awake when she returned, sitting by the fire mending a strap. Mara looked at her, looked at the pack, looked at her boots, which were clean and dried but had mud stains at the cuffs that were not from the road. "You were at the farm," Mara said. "I went to town," Zora said, "and then you were at the farm." Zora put her pack away and sat down by the fire. "He had a flooding problem. And now he doesn't. And now he doesn't." Mara was quiet for a moment in the very specific way of someone choosing their words carefully. "Zora, what is this?" Zora looked at the fire for a long time. "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest answer she had and the most frightening one, because Zora Stonefist generally knew what things were. Summer on the ridge was the best time. The elk came through in June, the clan made their big hunt, and the smoking and drying and preparation kept everyone busy and purposeful through the long, warm days. The kitchen gardens went in. Zora's plot was in a south-facing clearing where the sun hit right, and the days stretched out long and golden and full of work. She went to Harrow's mill roughly once a month through the summer, for trade goods or supplies, and she stopped at the farm sometimes and sometimes did not, and the sometimes that she did were the parts of those days that she turned over later in her thoughts the way you turn a smooth stone in your hand for no particular reason, just because it has a good weight to it. He came to the ridge once. This was the thing she had not entirely planned for. She had not invited him exactly. She had mentioned, when they were talking about the drainage channel, and he had asked questions about the hillside watershed above his property, that the spring that fed the upper channel was on the clan's ridgeland, and that if he wanted to understand the flooding problem properly, he'd need to see the whole system from above. She had said this practically, like a person explaining a map, not like an invitation. He took it as one. He appeared at the base of the ridge trail one Saturday morning in early July with a canvas pack on his back and the mule, Chalk, loaded with a sack of cornmeal and 2 jars of pickled vegetables, which he said he was bringing as a trade. He looked up the steep trail with the expression of a man who had committed to a thing and was not rethinking it. She had been down at the lower spring doing a water check when she heard Chalk's particular brand of sighing from below, and she came around the bend in the trail and stopped when she saw them. "You brought the mule," she said. "He looked like he wanted the exercise," Harvey said. She looked at Chalk, who looked back at her with his long face in a way that suggested he had not been consulted. She brought him up. The clan noticed his arrival in the way of any group of people who are paying attention to their borders, which orc clans always were. The elders, 3 women and 2 men ranging from 40 to over 70, came out to look at him with the level, measuring look that elders had when they needed to make a judgment about something. He stood in the middle of the compound, a rough circle of log buildings around a central fire pit, practical and solid and clearly built with serious intent, and met their looks without flinching and without overperforming. He was just a man standing there. Elder Datha, the oldest of them, a woman with gray hair and a face that had been making hard decisions since before Zora was born, walked up to him and looked him in the eye from about a foot away. She was 5'3". He was 5'10". It did not seem to matter. "You're the farmer," she said. "Harvey Warren," he said. "Yes, ma'am. Zora says you've been fair." "I've tried to be." Datha looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "Bring the mule to the water trough," and walked away, which was about as welcoming as Elder Datha got with strangers. He stayed through the afternoon. She showed him the spring that fed the upper channel. They walked to it through pine forest, up a steep trail that he climbed without complaint. And he saw how the snowmelt came off the upper rock face and fed into the spring pool, and he understood the whole watershed better after that. But the walk was also just a walk, through pine forest on a hot July day, with the birds loud in the canopy and the shade cool and good, and they talked about everything and nothing, which was something she had begun to understand was a specific thing that only happened with him. He traded his cornmeal and pickled vegetables with the clan's provisions manager, a young man named Krull who drove a hard bargain but was satisfied with the result, and he left in the late afternoon to get back before dark, because the mule got stubborn on downhill trails at night. As he was leaving, he stopped at the edge of the compound and turned back. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me come up." She had walked him to the trailhead. She was standing 4 feet from him in the late afternoon light that was going golden through the pines, and she was aware of the distance between them with a precision that had nothing to do with measurement. "It was practical," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those dark green eyes, and one side of his mouth went up, just slightly, just enough. "Sure it was," he said, and went down the trail with Chalk in tow. She stood at the trailhead after they had gone, listening to the creak of the harness growing fainter, and did not move for a longer time than was strictly necessary. Elder Datha appeared beside her with the silence that old orc women developed, having spent decades doing things quietly. "He looked at you the way a man looks at something he's trying to figure out whether he deserves," Datha said. "He was looking at the watershed," Zora said. Said Datha, and went back to the fire. Autumn arrived with the usual violence of the western reach. 1 week the days were warm and golden, and then a front came through, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, and everything smelled like cold and wood smoke and impending work. The clan went into preparation mode, the industrious, organized, urgent work of getting ready for winter, and Zora threw herself into it with the relief of purpose. She did not go down to Harrow's mill for 6 weeks. She told herself this was because there was too much to do on the ridge. This was true. It was also true that she had started to find the space between visits to the farm more significant than the visits themselves, had started to find herself thinking about his voice, his hands turning a mug, the way he listened when she talked, and this scared her in a way she was not accustomed to being scared. She had not been in love before. She had been close to it once with a young man of the clan 3 years ago, but it had not made it past the stage of mutual interest before he moved with a group to settle further north. That had not felt like this. This felt like something was already in motion, the way the creek ran fast in spring, not because she had decided it should move, but because the terrain had made it inevitable. She went down in October, when the first hard frost had set the ground and the clan's winter preparations were well enough along that she could take a day. She went straight to the farm. He was splitting wood when she arrived, which she had half expected. It was that time of year, and he was working with the rhythmic, economical efficiency of someone who split a lot of wood and had figured out the exact motion that produced the best result for the least effort. He heard the gate and looked up and set the axe down with the handle against the stump. 6 weeks, he said. "We were busy," she said. "I know, I figured," he studied her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and then, "I wanted to see if you were ready for winter." He looked around at the full woodpile, the smoke coming from the smokehouse, the root cellar door with fresh soil packed against it for insulation. "I think I am," he said. He tilted his head. "Are you?" She was quiet for a moment. "We're as ready as we get." He picked up the axe and set a new log on the stump. "Want to help me finish this?" he asked. "I've got maybe another cord to split and then I'm done until the next load." She picked up the second splitting maul that was leaning against the fence, and they worked side by side on the woodpile for an hour without talking much. Just the steady percussion of the maul and the axe against wood, the crack and tumble of split logs, the pile growing. It was good work. She liked good work. When they were done and had stacked the last of it, they stood side by side looking at the pile, both of them breathing hard and slightly flushed from the cold and the exertion. "There's stew on," he said. They went inside. The stew was good, a venison stew with root vegetables, the kind of thing that had been going since morning and had deepened into itself. She ate 2 bowls and he ate 2 bowls, and the fire was very warm, and outside the wind was beginning to pick up in the pines. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "The town council," she said. "Someone told Elder Datha they're talking about wanting the clan to move off the ridge, something about land claims. I don't know the details, but one of the trappers brought word." He was very still. "Who told the trapper?" "One of the alderman's men, apparently. Decker's name was mentioned." Something moved in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, but a kind of settled hardness. "The alderman's authority doesn't extend to the ridge land," he said. "That's outside the township boundary. It's open territory." "I know, but if they decide to make it an issue, then it's an issue I can help with," he said. "I know the land registry records. I know the boundary documents. My farm is right at the edge of the township, and I had to read every document they had when I settled it. The ridge is outside the charter. They have no claim." She looked at him. "You'd help with this?" "Of course I would," he said, like the of course was self-evident. She looked at her hands on the table. "Harvey, Zora," she lifted her eyes to his. "Why?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at her with those green eyes and the firelight between them and the wind in the pines outside, and then he said, "You know why." The room held the statement. She felt it in her chest, which was the same place she had been carrying that unnamed thing since the morning he gave her his coat, and she understood now what it was, had probably understood for a while but had not said it to herself directly. "This is complicated," she said. "Yes," he said. "The town, your neighbors, the clan. There are people on both sides who will not." "I know," he said. "I know what it is." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not interested in the opinion of Decker or anyone like him. And I think you know me well enough by now to know that." A pause. "I think you know what I'm saying to you." She did. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the fire snapped and settled and the wind pushed at the walls. Then she said, "I brought something back." He looked confused. "What?" She reached into her pack and brought out the coat, his coat, the wool coat with the fleece collar that she had returned in winter, which she had not had since then. But she had sewn it. She had taken it apart at the seams and re-sewn it, adjusted the shoulders and the sleeves, made it fit her frame instead of his. She had done this over the past several weeks carefully, without being sure why. She laid it on the table between them. He looked at it for a long moment. His expression was doing something complicated and quiet. "You resized it," he said. "You let me borrow it," she said. "I thought I should keep it, so there's always a reason to come back down the ridge." She said it carefully, meaning the other thing underneath it as clearly as she meant the surface thing. He reached across the table and took her hand. It was a simple thing, his hand over hers, big and warm and were cruffined. She looked down at it and then up at him, and what she saw in his face was not a man being uncertain or careful or performing something for her benefit. It was a man who had decided something and was at peace with having decided it. "I don't need you to have a reason," he said. "Come when you want to come. Stay when you want to stay, a beat. I'd like you to want to." She turned her hand over under his so that their palms were together. "I want to," she said. The months that followed were the most complicated and the most uncomplicated of Zora's life, often at the same time. They were complicated because the world had opinions. Decker voiced his loudly in the Stump and Stone, until Harvey went there one evening and said certain things in a voice that was not raised but was very clear, and Decker's opinions became quieter in public if not entirely absent in private. Widow Petal adjusted her prices when Zora came in and stopped letting her eyes do the calculation they used to do. A handful of the farmers north of town were politely cold when they encountered her and Harvey together, which they did occasionally when she came down and walked with him to town for whatever errands he needed to run. There was also, from the clan side, a conversation she had with the elder council that she had been expecting, and which went exactly as she had imagined it would go, not with outright opposition, because the Stonefist clan elders were practical people who cared about the clan's welfare more than about any particular social convention, but with a careful, measured examination of what this meant and what she wanted and what she had thought about. Elder Datha, who had been watching since July, simply asked her, "Do you trust him?" "Yes," she said, "with clan matters, with things that matter to us. He's already helped with the land registry. He got us copies of the boundary documents and wrote a letter to the township alderman that apparently caused the conversation about moving us to stop fairly quickly." Datha was quiet. Then, "And the rest of it, the personal," Zora looked at her. "He looks at me like I'm worth looking at," she said. "Not as a curiosity, not as something to be managed or tolerated, like I am just a person he is choosing." Datha was quiet for another long moment. "Then choose well," she said. Which was, from Datha, something close to a blessing. The uncomplicated part was the time between those things, the time in the cabin and on the farm and on the ridge trail and at the edge of the creek and in all the ordinary places where they were just themselves together. It was uncomplicated the way things are when they are true. She helped him fix the drainage channel properly that fall, a full day's work with proper timber framing and stone, and he came up to the ridge and helped with the fall hunt in a way that surprised her clan by being genuinely useful. He was a decent shot and a good worker, and he did not try to tell anyone how things should be done, which was the correct approach and which she had told him in advance. In November, when the first real winter snows came, she spent 2 days at the farm because a storm closed the ridge trail and it was safer to stay. She slept in the smaller room, in the narrow bed that had a patchwork quilt over it, and in the mornings he made coffee from the good beans he'd traded for at the post station, and they sat by the fire while the storm moved. On the second morning she came out to find he had already made breakfast porridge, good and thick, with dried fruit stirred in, and he was sitting at the table reading something by lamplight, and the cabin was warm, and outside the snow was coming down soft and steady, and the world was very quiet. She stood in the doorway between the rooms and looked at him, this man at his table in his morning, and something in her chest opened up like a door she had not known was closed. She went and sat down across from him, and he looked up and smiled, a real one, the kind he didn't deploy for general use, and poured her coffee without being asked, and she wrapped both hands around the cup and thought, "This is what it is. This is the thing I couldn't name." She named it to herself quietly. It was love. It was full and real and specific, directed entirely at this particular man, with his green eyes and his flour-dusted hands and his undemonstrative fundamental kindness, and she had no particular desire to do anything with it except sit with it in his warm kitchen while the snow came down. She told Mara when she got back to the ridge. Mara, who had been waiting for approximately 6 months for this information, simply sat down on the nearest log and pressed both hands over her mouth and made a noise that was very controlled and very expressive at the same time. "I knew it," she said finally. "From the coat. I knew it from the coat." "The coat was practical," Zora said. "Absolutely," said Mara, and went to find Elder Datha. He told her he loved her in January, which was not a surprising month for it. January on the Western Reach was the month when people told the truth, because the cold stripped away the things you could use to avoid the truth, and all that was left was the essential. She had come down for grain. She always needed grain. The clan always needed grain in January, and the weather had gone gray and threatening by the time she reached the farm, and they both knew she would not make it back up the ridge before it came down. He had said, "Come inside," and she had, and they had eaten and talked, and the fire had burned low in the way that fires burned low when the evening got late, and somewhere in the warm quiet of the late evening he had said it, not as a performance, not as a question or a request, just as a fact, stated with the same directness he brought to all facts, which was the only way he knew how to say anything. "I love you," he said. "I should have told you earlier, but I kept thinking you'd probably already figured it out, which was probably fair, but I wanted to say it directly." She looked at him. "I love you," she said back, and it was the easiest and the hardest thing she had ever said, and once she had said it, she did not understand how she had gone so many months without saying it, because it was true and had been true for a while, and truth generally wanted to be said. He came around the table and she stood up, and he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his neck, and the fire burned low and the snow came down outside, and the world was entirely simple. Spring arrived and they made decisions. The first decision was about where to live, which was a question that had been hovering over them, practically speaking, for some time. The farm was established and productive and had structures she could not ask him to walk away from. But the clan on the ridge was her people, and she could not simply walk away from that either, nor would he have asked her to. What they decided, which felt obvious once they had talked it through, was that she would keep her place in the clan through the year, spending significant time on the ridge, but would spend the cold months and any other time that made sense at the farm. The farm was close enough to the ridge trail, 3 hours, that this was practical. Over time, they would work toward a more permanent arrangement, possibly involving a second structure on the farm property, something of her own that connected the spaces. The second decision was to go to the town council together and formally register their partnership, which was what frontier townships used when people formed households, a simple document rather than an elaborate ceremony. This was Harvey's idea. He wanted it on record, he said, because records mattered, and because he wanted there to be nothing unofficial or undeclared about what they were. They went on a Tuesday in early spring, when the mud had dried enough to make walking pleasant. The council registrar was a thin, mild man named Fenwick, who spent most of his professional life recording land transactions and crop assessments, and was only occasionally called upon to record a partnership arrangement. He looked up at them over his desk, looked specifically at Zora with the controlled calculation she had come to recognize as Harrow's Mill's default expression toward her, and then he looked at Harvey, and Harvey looked back at him with the specific quality of attention that Harvey brought to things when he wanted to make a point without raising his voice. Fenwick recorded the partnership. He did it correctly and completely, and with a certain care that suggested he had decided, in the space of that look, that he was going to do his job properly. He gave them each a copy of the document and wished them well in a voice that was not warm but was genuine. They walked out of the council building into the spring morning, and she held the paper in both hands and felt the reality of it, the physical realness of a document that said she and Harvey Warren were a household, were a recognized thing, were on record as belonging to each other in the only way that mattered in a practical world. He put his arm around her shoulders as they walked, and she leaned into it slightly, which was something she had not done with anyone in a very long time. On the main road, a few people watched them, and some of the watching was hostile, and some of it was merely curious, and some of it, from a farmer's wife who ran the textile stall and who had been cautiously friendly toward Zora for a few months, was something that might have been a small, private smile. They had lunch at the Stump and Stone, which was the first time she had gone inside. The tavern keeper was a large woman named Bessie Guard, who ran the place with the efficient authority of someone who had no patience for drama that cut into her business day. She looked at them when they came in and showed them to a table without commentary, and brought them ale and bread and a bowl of the luncheon stew. And the tavern was half full, and people were doing what people in taverns generally do with other people's business, which is pretend not to notice while noticing completely. Decker was there in the corner with two men she didn't know. She saw him see them and watched his face do what it always did, the sourness, the compression, the calculated social injury. And then she watched Harvey not look at Decker at all, because Harvey had decided Decker did not deserve the attention, and she found she could do the same, and it was easier than she had expected. Bessie Guard came by at the end to collect their bowls, and she said to Zora without preamble, "You're the orc woman from the Ridge camp." "Yes," said Zora. "You've been fair when you've traded here," Bessie said, in the particular tone of a woman who was making an assessment she had been saving up. "So have your people when they come through. My last 2 loads of dried venison came from your clan's provisions man, and it was the best quality venison I've had in this valley." She picked up the bowls. "I run a fair establishment, you're welcome here." Zora looked at her. "Thank you," she said. Bessie nodded once brisk and moved off. Harvey picked up his ale. "Well," he said. "Well," said Zora. They walked back to the farm together in the spring afternoon, the trees beginning to green at the tips, the creek running clear and purposeful beside the road, and she thought that this was what progress looked like on the frontier, not sweeping, not announced, but small things, specific people making small decisions toward decency, and those decisions accumulating over time into something that could be called a life. Summer was full and good. He helped her put in a second kitchen garden down at the farm, better soil than the ridge plot, fuller sun, and the two of them planted it together one weekend in May, side by side in the dirt with the seeds and the markers and the good smell of turned earth. She had her hands in the soil up to the wrists, and he was 2 rows over doing the same, and they were talking about nothing in particular, about what would grow well and what probably wouldn't, and the sun was warm on her back, and she thought, This is the kind of thing I didn't know I wanted." He was a generous partner. Not in any elaborate or performed way, just in the practical daily way that mattered. He shared work without keeping a ledger of who had done what. He listened to her opinions and changed his mind when she was right about something without making a process of it. He did not try to smooth over or minimize or explain away the difficulties she encountered in town or in the world, but he also didn't let them define everything or live in every room. She in turn brought her own particular capacities to the partnership, her knowledge of the land and the ridge and the animal patterns, her relationships with the clan that allowed him into spaces no human had been before, her practical and direct mind that was useful in problem-solving and occasionally difficult in conversation, and which he seemed to genuinely like rather than merely tolerate. They were different in enough ways to be interesting and similar in enough ways to be safe. Mara came down to the farm in June to see where Zora spent her winters, and spent 2 days there with the combination of intense curiosity and studied nonchalance that she brought to all important things. On the second day she helped Harvey re-roof the smokehouse and declared him competent, and told Zora that evening while Harvey was doing the evening chores that she approved. "You didn't need to approve," Zora said. "No," said Mara agreeably, "but I do." In September, Elder Datha came down from the ridge. This was a significant thing. Elder Datha did not come down from the ridge. The ridge was where Elder Datha was by definition. She was a woman of the high country and had not been to Harrow's mill in years by choice, regarding the place with the specific disdain of someone who had seen enough of human settlements to have a calibrated view. She came down the ridge trail on a clear September morning with a walking stick and Mara as escort, and she walked the creek road to Harvey's farm with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who had been walking since before most people were born. She arrived at the farm gate and looked at the place with her elder's eyes, taking in everything, the layout, the winter stores, the garden, the structures, the quality of the maintenance. Harvey came out from the barn when he heard the gate. He saw who it was and went very still for a moment, and then he said, "Elder Datha, welcome to my farm." She looked at him for the long measuring moment she gave all important things. Then she said, Your smokehouse roof is new. Just redone it, he said. She walked past him into the yard and looked around with the calm authority of a woman conducting an inspection. She looked at the garden beds, at the woodpile, at the water trough. She went to the root cellar and opened the door and looked inside. She went to the barn and looked at the mule, who looked back at her. Finally, she came and stood in front of Harvey, and she said, "You'll winter her safe." It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. "She is Stonefist clan," Datha said. "She carries that. Whatever she is to you, she does not stop being clan." "I know that," he said. "I wouldn't want her to." Datha looked at him for another moment. Then she held out her hand, a human gesture she had adapted for dealing with humans who needed the ritual of it, and he shook it, and that was that. She stayed for the midday meal and ate Harvey's bread with the appreciation of someone who knew good bread, and she told him, unprompted, exactly what she thought of the drainage channel repair, which was that it was adequately done, and he received this as the compliment it was. And Mara caught Zora's eye across the table and looked very satisfied. After Datha and Mara headed back up the ridge, Harvey sat down in his chair and looked at Zora with an expression she read as something between touched and overwhelmed. "She came all the way down the ridge," he said. "She wanted to see," said Zora. "She wanted to inspect me," he said. "Same thing," he laughed, which was a thing he did with his whole face when something actually caught him, and she felt the familiar warm pull of watching him laugh. "I think I passed," he said. "The bread helped," she said. Winter came with its usual abruptness, and Zora moved down to the farm for the cold months as they had established, and the long, warm routine of two people wintering together settled around them like the snow settled around the cabin, covering everything, making the world quieter and more specific. She learned the particular rhythms of him in winter. The way he woke early and sat by the fire for a half hour before starting anything, not reading, not working, just present with the morning, which she had initially found strange and had come to understand as a kind of necessary quiet that she could respect. She learned that he was a better cook in winter when he had time to let things go slowly, that he reread the same 3 books from the shelf behind the door each winter and had opinions about all of them, that he was vulnerable to cold in his hands and wore his work gloves to the wrist even in the barn. He learned her that she needed to be outside at least once a day regardless of weather, that she was a morning person in the way that orc constitutions tended to be, up and clear-headed at dawn in a way that he found impressive and slightly unreasonable, that she had a singing voice she used only when she thought no one was listening, and that it was very good, a low, rich sound that she brought out for clan songs she had learned as a child. He heard it once through the closed door of the root cellar when she was working in there, and he stood outside the door and did not knock until she had finished. She found out about it because he mentioned it, later, carefully. She looked at him and he looked back at her, and she was not embarrassed exactly, but it was a moment of particular vulnerability, the kind that came from being heard when you thought you were private. "It's beautiful," he said. "Just the one thing, no fuss." She sang for him deliberately that evening, a clan song about the mountain season, which was the long summer on the high ridge that the songs described as something close to paradise. He sat across from her and listened with his green eyes and his full attention, and when she finished he said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, "Thank you," and meant it all the way down. In February, she told him she thought she might be pregnant. She had been careful in her counting and her knowledge of her own body, which orc women were generally good at by necessity, and the signs were specific enough that she was fairly certain rather than merely guessing. She told him on a Tuesday morning by the fire in the same direct way she told him most things, and watched his face go through several things very quickly, surprise, which resolved into something that she could only describe as an opening, like a window being raised. "Are you?" he started, and then adjusted, because he had learned that asking her how she felt was better than assuming. "How are you feeling about it?" "I'm not sure yet," she said honestly. "I needed to tell you first." He crossed to where she was sitting and crouched down in front of her chair and took both her hands. "Whatever you feel," he said, I'm here. This is ours, whatever we decide, and I'm not going anywhere." She looked at his face close now and felt the weight and rightness of him and thought, "Whatever is coming, this is the person I face it with, this one. I want it," she said. "I think I want it, a child." He tightened his hands around hers. "Then so do I," he said, very simple, very sure. She went up to the ridge the following week and told Elder Datha, who sat with the information for a long moment and then said, "Half-orc children are rare in this valley. They will be watched." "I know," Zora said. "They will need a clan and a name and a father who is steady." "He is steady," she said. Datha nodded slowly. "Then it is a good thing," a pause. "Bring him up in the spring. The elders should hear him speak about what he means to provide." Harvey came up in the spring and stood before the elder council in the compound's central fire pit area and was asked questions for about 2 hours, which he answered with patience and honesty and without trying to be more than he was. He told them what he had, what he could provide, what he understood about the difficulty of a half-orc child growing up between 2 worlds in a place that was not always generous, and what he intended to do about it. The elders asked hard questions about the town's likely response, about the land, about succession and naming, about what it meant to him that a child of his would be clan as well as his. He said, "I want the child to know both worlds and be proud of both. I want them to have the ridge and the farm, the clan's ways and what I know. I won't pretend there isn't hardship in that. But I think 2 parents who love them and each other are a better start than any of the hardship is an obstacle." Datha looked at him. "You've thought about this." "It's been my life," he said. "It deserves thought." She asked him one more question. "What is Zora Stonefist to you?" He said without hesitation, "Everything worth having." Datha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in the orc language which he did not speak, the formal elder's phrase that acknowledged a joining between a clan member and someone from outside, not exactly a blessing, but the closest thing the Stonefist clan had to one. Then she said in common, "Take care of each other." He said, "We will." The child was born in the early autumn of that year, when the leaves were just beginning to turn on the ridge and the air had the crystalline sharpness that meant winter was considering showing up. They had arranged for one of the clan women who had experience with births, an elder named Hessa who had delivered more children than she could count, to come down to the farm for the last weeks, and Hessa had settled herself into the small room with the patchwork quilt and made her presence felt in a way that was entirely welcome. Harvey, for his part, did what a good person does in that situation, everything that was asked of him, and then stayed out of the way of the people who knew more than he did. He kept the fire burning and the water hot, and the food coming and waited. It was a long labor and it was not easy, and there were hours in the middle of the night when the sounds from the small room made him sit at the table with his hands clasped and his eyes closed. Hessa came out once to check on the fire and saw him and said, in her matter-of-fact way, "She is strong. She has always been strong. Trust that." He did. The child came at dawn with the light just beginning to show gold at the window. It was a boy. He was bigger than most human newborns and greener than most human infants, with a soft fuzz of dark hair and tiny rounded ears, and his mother's amber eyes already showing in the blue-gray of newborn sight. No tusks yet, those would come later, but the jaw had a squareness to it that Hessa nodded at with satisfaction. He was entirely perfect in the specific way of newborn creatures, which is perfectly themselves and nothing else yet. Harvey held him for the first time in the doorway of the small room, with Zora exhausted and fierce in the bed behind him, and the dawn coming through the window, and Hessa cleaning up with the efficient practicality of someone for whom birth was a thing that happened, and then life resumed. He held the boy and looked at him and felt something in his chest that was larger than anything he had felt before, larger than grief or love or hope, but containing all of those, and he did not have a word for it except that it was true. "Hello," he said to the boy, very quietly. "Hello." He brought the boy to Zora, and she held him against her chest and looked at him with the look that was not quite like any other look, the total specific recognition of a mother for the particular child that is hers. "He looks like you," Harvey said. "He has your chin," she said. They named him Oren. Oren Stonefist Warren, with both names, because he belonged to both worlds and they intended to make sure he knew it. Hessa went back to the ridge after a week and brought word of the birth to the clan, and the clan sent back a gift, a small orc-carved cradle in dark pine, made by the woodworker Krull, who had driven such a hard bargain over the cornmeal, and who turned out to make extraordinary furniture when the need arose. It arrived on a Saturday, carried down the ridge by 4 clan members who set it in the cabin's main room, and stood around it with the satisfaction of people who had built something worthy of what it was for. Oren slept in it that first night, in the cabin that smelled of wood smoke and pine and bread, with the creek running outside and the fall stars clear and cold above the ridge, and Zora and Harvey sat on either side of the cradle in their 2 chairs and watched him breathe the way new parents watch, with the complete and slightly bewildered attention of people who have understood for the first time that the world contains something they cannot bear to lose. "What happens now?" Zora asked. Harvey looked at her over the cradle. "Now we raise him," he said, "and then we do it again probably if you're willing." She looked at Oren sleeping. "Ask me in a year." "Deal," he said. He reached across the cradle and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the warm quiet of the cabin, while their son slept between them and the fire burned, and the creek went on outside in the dark. The years after were what life was, not a single arc of story with a clear shape, but a layered accumulation of days and seasons and small decisions that added up to a world. Oren grew into a child who was both things at once, in the way that half-orc children sometimes could be large and green-skinned with his mother's jaw and his father's eyes, the amber and the green somehow mixed into a color all his own. He had his mother's physical directness and his father's patience, or sometimes the reverse, and from an early age he moved between the farm and the ridge with an ease that was the best possible result of everything his parents had worked to build. The clan elders received him completely. He had the Stonefist name and the clan's lineage on one side, and the elders made sure he knew it. Datha taught him the counting songs in the orc language when he was 3, sitting in the compound's firelight with her immense authority bent entirely toward a small child, and he learned them with the earnestness of someone who understood that being taught something important is itself a form of love. In Harrow's mill, the reception was more complicated, but the complication had a shape to it. Bessie Guard at the Stump and Stone was friendly to all of them without qualification. The Registrar Fenwick was formally correct in all their dealings and had over the years developed into something that might, generously, be called genuine decorum. A number of families who had arrived after the original settlement, newer frontier people with less entrenched opinions, simply accepted the Stonefist Warrens as part of what Harrow's mill was, which was the most organic form of progress. Decker left in the 3rd year and moved further west, which nobody mourned with any particular energy. Harvey Warren's farm expanded incrementally over the years. The drainage problem in the east pasture properly solved at last through a more permanent stone-lined channel. The kitchen garden expanded to include a herb bed that Zora managed with specific intention, a second outbuilding that became part storage and part workspace, and eventually the space where Zora did the curing and preparation of hides from the ridge hunts, which she sold through the general store at a fair price, and which the store sold at a good markup to the settlers who needed high-quality winter gear. A second child came when Oren was 4, a girl, born in winter this time with the snow thick on the ground, and Hessa again, making the trip down from the ridge with the same composed efficiency, declaring that some people would apparently require her services on a recurring basis. The girl was born quick and vocal, with lungs that she demonstrated thoroughly, and she came out smaller than her brother had been, but with a density of presence that Harvey recognized immediately as a specific kind of force. They named her Lana Stonefist Warren, same as her brother, with both names intact. Where Oren was a thoughtful child, Lana was an immediate one, interested in everything, opinionated about all of it, climbing everything climbable from the moment she could walk. She had her mother's coloring, the deep olive green, and her father's unruly hair, and a personality that was entirely her own, and which neither parent could account for except as the specific person she had arrived as. Aren adored her from the start, and was endlessly tolerant of her in the way that older siblings sometimes were when they were genuinely kind-natured. By the time she was 2, they were inseparable, which was both wonderful and occasionally catastrophic. Elder Datha saw Lana for the first time when the girl was 6 months old, when Zora carried her up to the ridge for a clan gathering. Datha looked at the child in Zora's arms for a long time, taking inventory with her elder's eyes. Then she said the clan greeting phrase in the Orc language, the formal one for new clan members. And Lana, who was at the stage of responding to all voices with either delight or suspicion, looked at Datha and grabbed her finger with both hands. Datha looked at the child holding her finger, then she looked at Zora. "She will be trouble," she said, with a satisfaction that was unmistakable. "I know," said Zora. "Good," said Datha. The years continued their accumulation. The farm found its permanent shape. What it was, what it grew, what it needed, what it gave back. Harvey's grain was consistently good, and he developed a small reputation for the quality of his barley in particular, which led to an arrangement with the mill that was steady and reliable. Zora's hides found their market, and she added a small tanning operation that employed 2 younger clan members who had come down from the ridge to try town life, giving them work that connected the clan's hunting to the settlement's economy in a way that was practical on both sides. She was 34 years old when Aren was 10, and she stood in the kitchen garden one late summer evening watching the last light go gold on the ridge above the pines, and she thought about the morning she had walked into Harrow's mill for grain and walked out with a borrowed coat and something she couldn't name sitting heavy in her chest. Harvey came up behind her and stood beside her, and they both looked at the ridge in the evening light. "You're thinking about something," he said. "The day I came to buy grain," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The coat, she agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, which she had been doing for 10 years now and which had not become ordinary, had remained exactly what it was, specific and warm and chosen. "I was terrified," she said, "coming into town, every time, but that morning especially. I was carrying it carefully, how I presented, making sure I took up exactly the right amount of space and no more." "You walked in like you owned the ground," he said. "That was the performance," she said. "Underneath it I was just hoping." He looked at her. Hoping for what? She thought about it for a moment, honestly. "To be treated like a person," she said. "Just that. It sounds small." "Isn't small," he said. She looked at the ridge, at the pines going dark against the orange sky, at the place where the trail wound up into the high country, the trail she had walked more times than she could count in both directions, going up to the clan and coming down to the farm and back again, the 2 worlds she carried and the space between them that had become, over years, less a gap and more a road. "You gave me a coat," she said. "You wore it home," he said, "and came back." "You came back," he said. "That was you." She turned and looked at him, this man, this specific man who had looked at her in Petal's general store 10 years ago with genuine curiosity and offered his hand and his name and eventually everything else, simply and without conditions. "I would do it again," she said. "All of it, exactly as it happened." He looked at her the way he always looked at her, like she was worth looking at fully without the background noise of anything else. "So would I," he said. A wren called from the barn, something about the mule having opinions about the evening water, which was entirely plausible given that Chalk's descendant, a young mule named Whetstone, had inherited all of the original Chalk's philosophies about inconvenient moments. Lana was in the house making a sound that suggested she had discovered something she should not have discovered, or was doing something she had been specifically asked not to do, which was the most likely scenario on any given evening. Harvey squeezed her shoulder. "Shall we?" "Yes," she said. They turned from the ridge and went back toward the cabin, the 2 of them. toward the warm lit windows and the sound of their children's voices, and the life they had made between one morning's grain purchase and this evening's golden light, which was the sum of all the small choices and the large ones, the borrowed coat and the returned coat altered to fit, the handshake that was just a handshake, and the love that was everything it was supposed to be. The ridge stood behind them in the dusk, steady and familiar, and the creek ran beside the road, and the smoke went up from the chimney into the clear autumn sky, and all of it was real, the whole of it, exactly as it was, complete. Inside the cabin, a wren came in from the barn with news about the mule that turned out to be funny, and Lana had indeed been doing something she had been asked not to do, which was attempting to reach a jar of preserves from the highest shelf using a creative arrangement of furniture. And Harvey lifted her down with the particular patience of a father who has learned that explaining things calmly is more effective than reacting. And Zora set the kettle on and watched her family arrange itself around the table. There was bread, there was stew on the fire, something with the last of the summer vegetables and a bone from last week's hunt. The fire was warm. Outside, the first stars were appearing above the ridge, sharp and cold and very clear. Elder Datha was alive still, moving more slowly now but presiding over the clan's gatherings with all her former authority intact. She had told Zora once, in the matter-of-fact way she had, that she intended to live until she was ready not to, and on current evidence she was not yet ready. She came down to the farm twice a year for the mid-season visits that had become tradition, and sat at Harvey Warren's table and ate his bread, and told him what she thought of his farming decisions with the same honest precision she had always brought to things, and he received this as the honor it was. The Stonefist clan on the ridge had grown. A few families had come in the years since, new clan members from distant groups who had heard there was good land on the western reach, and that a clan had established it solidly. The encampment had become a proper village of its own, with permanent structures and a smokehouse and a communal hall, and the relationship with Harrow's mill had evolved into something that was, if not entirely without friction, at least functional and often genuinely good. Mara had married a young man from the new families, a broad-shouldered hunter who was as easygoing as she was sharp-eyed, and they had 3 children who ran with a wren and Lana through the pines on summer visits, a tumbling herd of half-orc and full-orc children who did not spend much time thinking about distinctions because their parents had not given them reason to. The Stump and Stone under Bessie Guard's management had developed a habit of featuring game from the clan's hunts on its weekly dinner menu, a fact that Bessie announced simply and straightforwardly as the best available source, which it was, and which had the secondary effect of making it difficult for anyone who wanted to eat well to maintain certain opinions about the Ridge clan. Zora Stonefist Warren was known in Harrow's mill as the hide trader, and later also as the person who knew the Ridge watershed and could tell you where the elk would be 3 months before they arrived, which was information worth having, and she gave it plainly and was compensated fairly. And she walked the main street of Harrow's mill on market days without feeling the calculation in people's eyes, or at least without feeling it in all the eyes, which was as much as you could reasonably ask of the world. She was 41 years old when a wren turned 17 and began apprenticing with a woodworker in town, spending 3 days a week in the workshop, and coming home the other days with sawdust in his hair and a growing expertise in joinery that Harvey watched with the particular pride of a parent watching a child find their path. Lana at 13 was already climbing everything on both the ridge and the farm, with the determination of someone who had decided that height was a philosophical position, and was beginning to show a fierce interest in the herb knowledge that had come down from Harvey's wife's teaching through him to her, the plant medicines and their uses, which she learned with the same intensity she brought to everything. On a spring evening when a wren was 18, and just beginning to make his own decisions about his future, talking carefully about possibly going further west, seeing what was beyond the next ridge line, with the cautious ambition of someone who had been raised to think clearly about things. Harvey and Zora sat on the split-log bench he had built outside the cabin door, the bench that faced the kitchen garden and the meadow beyond it, and caught the evening light perfectly, which had been the intention when he built it. Aren was inside writing a letter. Lana was somewhere on the ridge with Mara's children. The evening was warm and still, and the garden was beginning to show its first green of the season, the early herbs and the cold-weather vegetables already up, the main beds not yet planted but ready, the soil dark and turned. "He's going to go," Zora said. "I know," Harvey said. "Good." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "I came out here because there was somewhere I needed to get to. He has somewhere he needs to get to. That's how it should go." She thought about this. About the road that had brought her down the ridge that first morning, and the road that had brought him out to this particular stretch of creek, and all the roads that had run alongside those roads, parallel until they met. "You're not sad. I'm proud," he said. "And yes, also sad, both." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "He'll come back," she said. "He has roots here, both kinds." "He does," Harvey agreed. The garden sat before them in the early evening, alive and purposeful, and the ridge was behind the house, and the creek was alongside the road. And Lana's voice came from somewhere up the slope, laughing at something. The full, honest laugh she had, that she got from no one particular because it was entirely her own. Zora thought about a morning in February long ago when she had stood before an elder council and explained that this man looked at her like she was worth looking at, and how that had seemed like everything necessary and also barely sufficient to explain what it actually was, this specific thing, this life. She thought about a coat and a handshake and bread cooling on a cast iron pan. She thought about the things she had not been able to name, sitting heavy in her chest on a cold morning with 30 pounds of grain on her back, walking up a ridge trail with the south wind coming in. She had named it now. She had been naming it for years, every morning over coffee and every evening in the kitchen, and every night in the particular quiet of two people who knew each other completely and had chosen it again every day. Love. It was love, and it was Harvey Warren, and it was this bench and this garden and this ridge and these children and this life, all the way down to the roots. She took his hand where it rested on his knee and held it. He turned his palm over and held hers back. The evening light went gold on the garden and the pines and the ridge above, and the creek ran alongside the road, and Harrow's mill turned in the distance with its ancient wheel on the water, and two people sat on a bench in the last warmth of a spring day and were exactly where they were supposed to be, in the life they had built from a grain purchase and a borrowed coat and the accumulated weight of 1,000 small choices, each one true, each one made in the direction of the other. This was what remained. Not the hardship, though it had been real, and not the opposition, though it had been present, and not the complications of two worlds and all their friction and history. What remained was the bench and the hand and the garden coming green in the evening light. What remained was enough. What remained was everything.